Hello, my name is Vanessa Andreotti. I am speaking from Vancouver, the University of British Columbia, where I'm a professor. The University of British Columbia is located on the unceded territory of the Musqueam Indigenous people here in Canada. I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to be part of the conference and for asking me to offer you a few stories, a few provocations, a few frameworks, and perhaps some questions that could help you think about ethics in the context of partnerships that you are engaged in. So I'll start by saying that my work is related to bringing people together, bringing very diverse people together to have difficult conversations without relationships falling apart. And in that work, we see global citizenship education or global education as the kind of education that helps us to dig deeper and to relate wider. But in order to do that, we need to address some of the historical and systemic issues that may be preventing our relationships from being established in a good way. So I work with a collective of people, of researchers, of artists, of students, and of activists who are part of this collective called Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures. So in this collective, we see that the problems that we're facing, the global problems that we're facing today, are all interconnected. So unsustainability, violence, climate change, mental health crisis, labor precarity, economic instability, rise of populism, all of that is interconnected. And it is related not to a lack of knowledge about, like, if we had more knowledge, we could solve it, but fundamentally to a harmful habit of being, a harmful habit of existing and relating to each other that is based on the separation between us and the land and beyond the land, between us and the other animals, between us and the plants, between us and the atmosphere, between us in relation to each other, between cultures and between people. So in order to interrupt this harmful habit of being, of seeing ourselves as separated and creating the sense and the notion and the feeling that we're all part of a bigger metabolism, of a wider metabolism, we do some experiments, some educational experiments that are experiential in nature and that use the land and the body for us to activate the senses in that direction. So we're not going to do that today, but this is part of the work that we do. Today is just going to be more about the information that we need, about mistakes that have been made and continue to be recurrent in this area of partnerships, so that if we map these mistakes, we can make different mistakes only, not the same ones that have been made before. However, addressing these mistakes is also very complicated because the unequal relationships between, for example, the global north and the global south are embedded in the ways that institutions operate and in the ways that the media speaks to us, the ways even that schools teach about poverty, progress, development, and wealth, for example. So it's trying to interrupt patterns that are harmful is something extremely difficult. So I would like to start by acknowledging that. And that's why when we bring people together to talk, it is difficult to have difficult conversations because people would prefer to have conversations that are easier and that create a sense that we're all together, they're all moving forward, so that we can feel good, we can look good, and we can do good. But these desires for just feeling good, doing good, and looking good and moving forward very often become blockages to the necessity that we have to talk about the difficult, uncomfortable, and complex issues that we need also to talk about. And just talking about it is also not, um, maybe not going to solve it. We will need to put our bodies into into the conversation and learn to feel differently. We need to relate differently to the land that we have, that we belong to, which is the planet, right? We need to relate differently to each other and show up differently to this work. So this is what I'm going to be talking about today. So why I do this work? I come from a family that is of mixed heritage. So my dad is of German heritage or ancestry, and my mom is of indigenous ancestry. And my dad's family immigrated to Brazil after the First World War. And my dad was born during the Second World War. And as he was growing up, he saw his brothers, who were older than him, engage in activities in Brazil related to agrarian expansion that were very violent towards indigenous people. So it's fair to say that his brothers, my uncles, were involved in killing indigenous people in order to support a policy of agrarian expansion in Brazil so that people could have the land to farm. And my dad was against that. He thought that this was horrible, and he wanted to make a stand about that, and he wanted to go against his family in relation to that. So one of the things he decided to do was to marry an indigenous person from Brazil, as a statement and also as a way of saying that you shouldn't kill these people, right? But he also wanted to say that because he was white and European and German, that his ways were much better than the ways of the indigenous people, that by marrying somebody he would be helping my mom whiten the future generations. So I was born out of a historical conflict and with a project to help improve the genetic stock of a certain group of people, right? So in many ways, what my dad was doing in relation to his brothers was very progressive, and he was making a stand courageously about something that was unfair and unjust. On the other hand, he was doing it in a racist way. So the idea of improving the genetic stock for whiteness is a racist project. So my dad embodies the complexity of wanting to change the world in very problematic ways. And I am the product of that idea. So as I was growing up, I could see the paradoxes, the complexities, the contradictions happening in the relationship between my dad and my mom. And they're still together and they don't agree. And being brought up in that environment gave me the idea that first I thought there was a problem with me or with my family, but we're actually, my family reflects what's happening in the world. And learning to create good relationships within the family, even though people didn't agree, even though there were a lot of external forces in this conflict, it was important for us to be a family, right? So I think that's what informs my work. I also lived in many different countries, and I'm a mother of children who were growing up in different countries. We lived in England, we lived in New Zealand, we lived in Finland, and now we're living in Canada. So the experience of being an immigrant is also something, and a mother of immigrant children, they are things that inform the work that I do in trying to bring people together to have difficult conversations without relationships falling apart. So when I started doing work in global citizenship education, there was also a story that really marked for me how the experience of my family was an experience much wider than than just our local context. So I was the project manager for, and this was 1999. So I was a project manager for a project of the British Council on global citizenship education. And in this project, I was supposed to link schools in Brazil with schools in England. And this partnership should be equitable and sustainable and long term, right? So my work with partnerships started there. So the first thing that they did was to send me to England. I was living in Brazil at the time. They sent me to England to a conference of school principals that were discussing global partnerships. And I was presenting the possibility of school links with Brazil, and many people were very interested. Some people were interested because they wanted to work with the thematic area of the Amazon. Others were interested in sports. So this was already a little bit problematic from my perspective. But what really surprised me was that as I was speaking to many of the principals, they wanted me to connect them with a school out in the Amazon, but in the middle of nowhere. They would say, I want the schools not to have access to tap water. And then I asked, well, why do you want that? It's going to be very difficult. If they don't have water, they won't have internet, for example. And they would say to me, we want our students to connect with a poor community or a school in a poor community so that they feel grateful for living in the UK. And I said, this is not something that I would expect, but it really it didn't feel good to me at the time. And then I asked them, so if you're teaching the children in Brazil that they are poor so that your children feel grateful for being in a wealthy country, what are the educational implications of this, right? What are you teaching the kids in Brazil? And they would say, oh, don't worry about the kids in Brazil. We will send them old computers, old books, sometimes old shoes, right? And I felt really uncomfortable at that point, and I didn't know how to articulate what the problem was. But I went back to Brazil, and I called a conference with Brazilian teachers in the public school where I was working. And I asked them, so do you want to link with people in the UK, establish a partnership with schools in the UK? And they said, yes, we would love to. And I said, why? Why would you like to do that? And they said, because we want to show our students in Brazil what it means to be developed. And I said, right. So there is a system where there is a story of progress, development, and human evolution over here, and other people who are dragging behind over here, right? And this system is just reproduced. And then I asked them, so why do you want to teach students that? And they said, because that's the way to go, and because then they can also help us, sending us old computers, old books, and old shoes, right? So from a project management perspective, it was very easy. Like, the people over here wanted the same as the people over here. But as an educator, I couldn't sleep at night. I said, this is not, in the long term, this is not the best way to go. And this has several problematic implications. So I started to ask, why do we think like this? Why do we believe that there is a single story of progress, development, and human evolution? and I started working with the metaphor of the yellow corn cob in that sense. So I started to ask people to imagine a field of corn cob, to collect the corn cob, to put the corn cob in front of them, and I asked them to compare what they saw in their imagination with a picture of multicolored corn cobs that I would show them on a slide. And I used the metaphor of the yellow corn cob that is mostly in most people's minds to talk about how our imagination has been colonized by the images and the narratives that we get exposed through the media, through schools, and through our relationships in society, and how difficult it is to think outside of that narrative. And then from there, thinking about the relationship between the yellow corn cob and other forms of corn cob, I started looking at partnerships and trying to map usual patterns of representations and engagements that we see between the North and South. And I came up with the Heads Up acronym that shows how these partnerships are usually hegemonic. They present one idea of the single story without really questioning where this idea comes from or whether it really erases other possibilities of other conceptualizations of progress and of development, other possibilities of being. These partnerships are usually ethnocentric. They promote one view as universal, as the view that everybody should have. They are often ahistorical. They do not consider our historical connections, especially in relation to colonialism and how we are connected also in very violent ways. In how the wealth that we have here is actually extracted from other places. Then there is D, which is depoliticized. These partnerships are generally depoliticized. They do not look at the uneven power relations, the imbalances of power relations, and the implications of that. S is that the partnerships tend to be salvationist or self-serving or self-congratulatory. It's about the North feeling good about helping the South, and this focus on feeling good and making a difference actually has wider implications about what projects get funded, what projects get chosen, what projects are possible, and what projects and types of partnership and collaboration are not possible, but it should be possible. Then U represents uncomplicated solutions. So because people want to feel good and achieve something, generally the actions that are chosen are actions that are easy to implement, but that do not necessarily interrupt systemic patterns and do not necessarily create systemic change, but that are just easily implementable, easily fundable, and then have this we did it effect, but they might have very, very little impact beyond the life of the project. And P is paternalism. So paternalism is the trend, the pattern where you infantilize the other community. You say, okay, I'm the good person coming to help you, and you need to be grateful for what I've done for you. So you expect a thank you at the end. And when people disagree with you or challenge what you're doing, you become very upset because these people then are ungrateful, right? So if they don't appreciate your efforts to help them. So that is the pattern of paternalism. So this acronym Heads Up now is being used or has been used for the last 10 years to evaluate partnerships and help people from the North and South to try to renegotiate their relationship. But I have to say that observing this last 10 years, I can say it is incredibly difficult to change these patterns, to interrupt these patterns, because every time you try to interrupt it, you create another problem. And also because the funding structures, the institutions are not necessarily open to not operating in that way. So it's not an easy thing to do. So Heads Up is a useful tool, I think, to look at partnerships. And in terms of global education, the frameworks that we're using in the collective right now point to also the need to look at four denials. So in terms of global citizenship education, we start from the starting point is the starting point that we have to work with undoing for negations, for denial. So the first is the denial that these the comforts that we have today in high-income countries are connected with violence somewhere else. So they come from exploitation, expropriation, destitution, dispossession, and destruction somewhere else. And therefore we are complicit in harm, like our comforts and our pleasures, our securities are all subsidized by other people, by other communities that suffer as a result of our privileges. And this entails the responsibility for interrupting this violence. But this is not a responsibility to say, okay, I'll interrupt the violence now and I'm not going to be complicit. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is our ability to sit with the impossibility of individually interrupting this and understanding how this violence affects other bodies and other places and other communities is part in sitting with that difficult knowledge, that painful knowledge, without wanting to just move away from it or turn your back to it or looking for innocence individually. This is not the proper answer, right? So how do we sit with our complicity in harm? How do we dig deeper in this area without being overwhelmed or without wanting just to feel good, right? This is uncomfortable, this is painful, but this is necessary for us to be able to be together. The second denial is the denial of unsustainability. So the denial of unsustainability is the denial of the limits of the planet. Understanding that this level of comforts and securities is not going to last. We're going to have to surrender these lifestyles that are based on overconsumption and also political projects based on exponential economic growth. The planet cannot sustain the level of consumption, production of waste, and extraction and pollution that our species has created. And we are jeopardizing our own survival in this planet. Actually, the planet is going to be fine without us. We are jeopardizing our survival as we are eliminating the possibility of other species to survive as well. And we have already done that. The level of biodiversity has been exponentially reduced already as a result of our activity. The third denial is the denial of entanglement, the denial that we are interdependent, we're not separated. We have a metabolism that is the planet, and we are part of this metabolism. We live and we die and we go back to the metabolism. The air that we breathe in is the air that the trees breathe out. So we need to honor this interdependence in a very different way by relating to the planet very differently. And this is also very difficult to do. And the fourth denial is the denial that these problems are very deep and they're wicked in nature. They are complex, they are complicated, and therefore simplistic solutions, quick fixes, or band-aids are not gonna solve these problems. We will have to come up with something much more complex, and that is much more difficult to achieve as well, especially if we want to do it together, if we want to face these challenges together. We will have to be in a different state of being just to show up to be able to do this work together. We won't be able to do it in the ways that have created the problems in the first place. We'll have to find another way. And imagining something different, as we saw with the yellow corn cob, is very difficult. So the challenge is there for us to face these issues, these global issues together. We will need a very different way of being. And how to achieve that through education is a question that I'm interested in. So the last framework that I think I'm going to leave with you with a question is a framework related to this other way of being that relates to our desires and motivations for doing this work. So a lot of people I've worked with decide to change the world out of a sense of wanting to connect wider, to expand their connections, but the media, especially social media now, has captured this desire and transformed it into this consumptive, or this desire for consumption of knowledge, consumption of relationships, consumption of experiences. And a lot of people now are engaging with global change out of a desire for feeling good, for looking good, for doing good, and for moving forward. So I am going to ask you to problematize these desires and try to find alternative aspirations. For example, instead of feeling good, I would suggest that what we need is to be able to sit with the pain of all these violences, all these fractures in society, and change our relationship with pain. So a lot of people think that for them to be well, they need to be pain-free. I'm suggesting, and this is coming from indigenous communities that I work with, that well-being is about also being able to sit with the pain and to honor the lessons that come from this pain. So it requires more time. It requires a different form of commitment that we have in the process. So it requires listening to how other people feel, especially if they're telling us that we are doing something harmful, and not feeling offended or wanting immediately to be comfortable. It's about welcoming the critique and sitting with it in a very good space and saying, okay, this is the work that needs to be done. It's painful, it's complex, and I'm here, I'm gonna do it. The second thing about looking good and putting things on Facebook, look how wonderful I am and how much I have done. I would invite you to, instead of doing that, shifting the desire to show yourself to a desire to grow up, right? So growing up means taking responsibility for not just looking the part, but actually doing the work that is needed rather than the work that you want to do. And sometimes this means doing work that is not very glamorous, that you wouldn't put on Facebook, but that's the most important work to do, right? Sometimes it's like cleaning the dishes versus winning a marathon. And all this work is necessary if we want to be facing these challenges together. The third thing, which is about doing good, I would ask you to ask who decides what's good, in whose name, for whose benefit, how come, where is this coming from? Where is this leading to, right? Who decides what is good? And to see if what we understand as good is related to that yellow corn cob story. Is that yellow corn cob defining what is good for your community or for the communities that you work with? And if it is, what other possibilities are you missing, right? What is being missed when we choose a single story of progress, development, and human evolution? And this doing good is also about asking if this is all unsustainable, right? If we're kind of in the Titanic, the Titanic is going down. What do? Do you sell more tickets to the Titanic? Do you try to fix the Titanic? Do you learn to swim? Do you go for the life-saving boats that only the very wealthy people are going to get? What do we do as we face the unsustainability of what is perceived to be the ideal society, right? And the patterns of consumption that we have in the societies. And the last thing in relation to moving forward, I would like to invite you to think, instead of moving forward, digging deeper and relating wider. So the challenge here is to be able to show up very differently in a very generative way, knowing it's not going to be easy, knowing it's going to be messy, it's going to be uncertain, but having the stamina and the resiliency to actually show up for the work, right? And say, I don't know, but I'm here to learn together, and I am going to be at my best space, to be able to face the difficulties without being afraid of being uncomfortable, without being afraid of not looking that good, of without being afraid of not receiving the award at the end, right? So just doing what needs to be done rather than what you want to do. So I would like to finish this conversation with an image that we've been using in the project, and it is the image of a group of us that were we were in Peru. There was a very busy road that we had to cross to get to a center on the other side of the road, and we were all waiting to see when the traffic was going to stop so that we could cross. There was no pedestrian crossing there, and this little dog decided to cross the road, right? And it was really interesting to see what happened in the group at that point. So some people saw the dog going and closed their ears, others closed their eyes, others closed their mouth because they wanted to scream, others screamed, others froze. And one person, without thinking and without making it all about herself, went to the middle of the road and stopped the traffic, right? And then the dog passed. She went after the dog, petted the dog, told the dog not to do it again, and just went and did what she had to do and didn't even remember she had done the stopping of the traffic. What I suggest here is that we need more people who can stop the traffic. And I would like to invite you to develop yourself, I would like to invite you to grow up to be those people. As we face these global changes, as we face climate change, as we face mass migration, as we face global mental health problem, we will need people who can go to the middle of the traffic and stop patterns and allow different things to happen. And this is difficult. And this cannot be done as a heroic act. I did it and I'm going to post it on Facebook. This needs to be done as something that just needs to be done. And it's not a big deal, right? But we need to get out of the pattern of closing our eyes and ears and our mouth and be able to do things for the right reasons. So, which for me is the reason that we're all interwoven with each other. We're part of the same metabolism, and this metabolism is sick. and we will need to be together and have difficult conversations without relationships falling apart, so that we can find other ways of existing in the planet. So I think that was my message for you today. And yeah, I hope you have a great conference and a great conversation, and that I will be accessing the questions that you have later on in the conference. Thank you.